Hello, I'm Josh Radcliffe, and I'm here with my partner Christian Koch, and we are reporting live from Paris, where tomorrow the United Nations Climate Change Conference will be holding COP21.
Earlier this morning, at a speech by new Filipino President Gajuda, he once again denied the realities of climate change. And despite international collaboration and overwhelming consensus on climate change, President Gajuda refuses to enact policies to create an environmentally friendly and sustainable Philippines nation. Let's take a look.
As Filipino president, I refuse to believe that our world is heating up. Humans have been on Earth for thousands of years. It's absurd to think that just now the world is starting to heat up. There is no conclusive evidence to suggest that our Earth is heating up, and I refuse to take any further action.
You know, Christian, this will be the first time since the early 90s that a Filipino president has been skeptical on the idea of climate change. Past presidents have always been prominent voices in international negotiations involving climate change too.
Yes, it will surely be an interesting event to see how President Gajuda's negligence toward climate change will eventually play out in future international efforts on climate change.
Gajuda is still refusing to accept realities of climate change.
Who are you? Where am I?
President Gajuda, I am the ghost of climate change past, and we are in your dream. I am here to take you on a journey to help educate you to understand the realities that climate change is inflicting on your country.
Like I said before, I refuse to
You, President Gajuda, have much to learn about the facts on climate change. If you do not act, your country will be in grave danger. Come with me. President Gajuda, there are many aspects of climate change that I will be showing you tonight. First, I must introduce you to my friends Nina and Linda. Nina and Linda are experts in the field of vulnerabilities that climate change brings to your country, as well as experts in the fields of opportunities that climate change can also bring to your country.
The Philippines is an extremely vulnerable country to the effects of climate change. Climate change leads to population displacement so that at least 13.6 million people living in the coastal areas in the Philippines are expected to displace to upland and safer places. As the temperature and the acidity of the ocean increase, coral reef degradation is vulnerable to many of the coastal villages that depend on the coral reefs for fishing and tourism. Also, rising temperatures lead to severe loss in agriculture, production including human lives. Consumer price index will increase, causing difficulties for Filipinos to access food at a reasonable cost. And water problems, the Philippines could cause a loss of drinking water and a steady supply of water agriculture. Water quality is a problem because of the mass flooding, which is polluting the water. They also cause a problem for food security. Without proper water for farming, many people are losing their crops and their livelihood. Therefore, many people can be easily exposed to malnutrition and starvation due to crop loss.
About the opportunities, first we're going to talk about the alternative energy. Utilizing alternative forms of energy has created a new business scale and new employment opportunities. The country can now be more ecologically sustainable by using the solar and the wind-powered energy and reduce its ecological impact on the environmental, especially for the geothermal energy. Since climate changing already affects the Philippines, they generalized using a new clean renewable energy, which is the geothermal. In Philippines, geothermal energy already provides 27% of the country's total electricity production generated in power plants. The other thing we're going to talk about is modernizing infrastructure. Because the Philippines is an island country, tropical storms are very prevalent, which has had devastating effects on people's home and livelihoods. With the increase in modernizing infrastructure and technology, Philippines are now able to rebuild a more modern way, which can help combat the natural disaster that they might face. The last thing is about innovation of heat tolerance in rice. Heat tolerance rice helped it to develop a new rice drill type that can tolerance heat up to 38 degrees. The new rice can adapt to rising temperatures and also have vulnerable so that the farmers can obtain the new heat tolerance rice drill type with the higher during the reproductive stage.
You see, President Kajuda, there is much you need to learn about global climate change if you wish to be the leader of the Philippines. Now, the second aspect of climate change that I must teach you has to do with your country's history involving its use of fossil fuels and deforestation in your country. This is my next friend, Josh. He is an expert in this field.
Hello, I'm Josh, and I'm an expert in the history of fossil fuel use and deforestation in the Philippines. The Philippines is still a developing country right now because it was never able to industrialize due to the colonization by Spain back in 1521. It was under Spain's control until 1898 when the Treaty of Paris was signed, which ceded the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million after the Spanish-American War. The Philippines then began its transition towards independence in 1935 when it became a self-governing commonwealth. Finally, in 1946, the Philippines gained independence. The Philippines was highly influenced by other countries during colonization. Anthropogenic greenhouse gases in the atmosphere increased due to the activities associated with energy, industry, agricultural, land use, and wastes. Land conversion and development combined with exploitation of farming had taken the country's forests, marine life, and environment. When looking at the Philippines with respect to climate change, it is one of the most vulnerable countries even though it has a relatively small carbon footprint. The Philippines haven't had a long history with fossil fuels, and that began during 1971. During this time, fossil fuel use contributed to only about 51% of energy consumption. This remained relatively consistent until around the 1980s, when fossil fuel use dropped to around 30 to 40% of energy consumption. Since then, it has again risen, and the Philippines has been battling a deforestation problem for a long time now, which is a huge problem because of the forest plays such a substantial role in the indigenous people's lives and culture. Deforestation on a small scale began in 1521 when the first Spanish colonizers came to the Philippines. After the Philippines was ceded to the U.S., there was an increase in commercial logging, which resulted in the Philippines becoming a lead supplier to the world timber market. The most notable time period of deforestation was from 1946 to 1995. Deforestation most notably resulted in the unprecedented damages in minority culture and ecology. Although reforestation efforts were made, they weren't able to meet the demands for sustainability.
So, President Kajuda, have you learned anything about the serious issues of climate change after meeting our first experts?
Well, I think I'm starting to realize the climate change is an issue that I should be concerning myself with in my country.
Very good. I think you're learning. Now tell me, what do you know about your country's history when it comes to its role in addressing climate change? What do you know about the UNFCCC? How about your country's role in Kyoto?
Well, what I know is
The Philippine government's response has always been proactive when responding to climate change. Prior to the UNFCCC, Philippine President Corazon Aquino created the Interagency Committee on Climate Change, which coordinates, develops, and monitors activities related to climate change in the country and shapes policy recommendations. The history of participating in negotiations and discussing regarding climate change, both nationally and internationally, the most important outcomes of these negotiations include the implementations of the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, was created May 9, 1992, where the Philippines was among the first nations to sign. Amongst the 159 countries that attended the third UNFCCC conference in Kyoto, Japan, the Kyoto Protocol was created to stabilize GHG concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent anthropogenic interference with the climate system through quantified emission targets within a specific time frame. The Philippines wanted policies and projects that contributed to the UNFCCC's objective of stabilization of greenhouse gas emissions. They wanted policies that would lead to environmentally safe and sound technology, the conservation of biological diversity, and sustainable use of natural resources, while at the same time trying to alleviate the national poverty. In 2009, the Clean Development Mechanism, or the CDM, showed the Philippines' interest in climate change mitigation. This helped developing countries reach sustainable development goals. In 1997, Philippines drafted the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which set out to identify the general thrusts of the government to address issues of climate change. In 2009, the Philippines enacted the Climate Change Act, which established a climate change commission to formulate the NFS-CCC in the Philippines and mainstream climate change into government policies. In 2010, the National Framework Strategy on Climate Change was drafted. The goal was to build an adaptive capacity of communities, increase the resilience of national ecosystems to climate change, and optimize mitigation opportunities towards sustainable development. In 2011, the National Climate Change Action Plan was approved. This laid out a long-term plan for the Philippines' agenda for adaptation and mitigation. As the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries when it comes to the effects of climate change, the country sees great collaboration between the federal government and local communities to achieve a green, energy-efficient society. However, the country has a history of political corruption and vast socioeconomic inequalities. When a disaster hits, such as Category 5 typhoon in 2013, social fault lines are greatly exposed and the population is unprepared for disasters. Many isolated communities have no warning, nowhere to go, while the wealthier people are aware of the storms and can take necessary precautions.
Very good, Mr. President. I'm glad to hear you knew some things about climate change in your country. Now the question remains, what will you do to continue your country's legacy in advocating for climate change intervention?
I'm not sure yet.
Have a seat, Mr. President. I have a few recommendations for you. As far as political recommendations go, while your country is not a fairly wealthy country, your country is, however, extremely vulnerable to the effects of climate change, which is why you must seriously recognize the realities of climate change. You must lead by example. Just because the Philippines is a developing country should not exempt you from reducing carbon emissions. And the Philippines should take on more responsibilities to advocate and voice other developing countries' needs within the UNFCCC, those specifically vulnerable to climate change. Seek funding for sustainable efforts from wealthier countries such as Norway. However, it is also time your country capitalized on its own national-based interests. You must capitalize on sustainable energy and subsidize agriculture industry to promote the well-being for your small farmers. You must also expand existing geothermal technologies as well as hydropower and solar-powered electricities. The dominant parties of your country must aim to protect the environment for the benefit of current populations but as well as future generations. You must also keep in mind the situations of the vulnerable populations within your country, such as farmers and native peoples. You play a key role in facilitating international negotiations. You could be a voice for all other countries' people who are in a similar situation. While changing to a greener economy could be economically difficult, you must act to the full extent of your economic country's capabilities. Which brings you to my next point of cost-benefit analysis. These recommendations will not only help to reduce ecological impacts, but in time your country will adapt to environmentally friendly technologies. These will prove to be pricey, but that is why you must seek financial assistance from other countries. It will be vital to your success. In the end, the transition from fossil fuels to sustainable energy will also create new socio-economic opportunities for the Filipino peoples and create upward mobility for all. Given the social analysis, these recommendations will empower all groups of the Philippines, not only economically but socially as well. The recommendations will not harm any vulnerable populations within your country, but will in fact empower them. I recommend leaving resources for future generations without sacrificing current generations. You don't want to use up all of your resources in one generation because it would hinder growth for other generations as well as be detrimental for all. You must also begin investing early on, but it must be slow and incremental so that other generations can continue to invest and have a smooth transition to a renewable energy-based economy. Seeing that the Philippines is a developing country that has many socioeconomic barriers, the country will need assistance from wealthier countries. As far as the theory of justice goes, the Philippines, despite its low contribution to historical global greenhouse gas emissions, which is about 0.3%, has always been ranked one of the most vulnerable countries to the effects of climate change. By pressing for developed countries within the UNFCCC to take the lead in combating climate change by cutting emissions, it will ultimately bring more justice for your country. And before I leave this topic, I'll leave you with a quote from your PMCJ. This is a time of outpouring of support and solidarity from all around the world. We are touched and strengthened and grateful, but our people need more than solidarity. We demand climate change. This is why you must also keep in mind the vulnerable groups within your country: women, indigenous peoples, poor people, and farmers. As far as women's residence in rural areas creates economic disparities because there is little work in the rural areas. By training and educating them, more jobs will be provided for women, and the economic disparity will be decreased. Indigenous people. They live in fragile ecosystems that are extremely vulnerable to any changes in climate change. Their living environment can be protected by reducing CO2 emissions as well as deforestation. As far as poorer people go, the challenges for them are food security, poverty, and health disparities. Uniting with other developed countries and seeking assistance from developed nations will help to decrease the financial burden on your government. And lastly, farmers. Recent natural disasters and climate change are creating many challenges for your farmers. The decrease in deforestation will reduce greenhouse gases and make fertile land as well as subsidize farming industry easier for your country. Giving people economic incentives to become farmers will increase the Philippines' crumbling farming industry.
Ugh, is that real?
Good evening. Once again, this is Christian and Josh coming at you live from Paris, outside the Conference of Parties.
We have just received some very groundbreaking news. President Kajuta of the Philippines is making a live statement after his visit at the Conference of Parties. Let's take a look.
After much thought and a visit to the Conference of Parties, I have decided that it is my duty as president to acknowledge climate change effects and to alter my views to protect my country. I will begin writing up new policies to ensure the long-term success of the Philippines.